Hello, John Felt here. This is the Blue Water Outlook Weekly Water Outlook for March 31st, 2013. Well, generally speaking, it's been a pretty quiet week over the Midwest. Now, there have been some exceptions, and one very notable exception was a band of heavy snow that developed in Colorado, moved across Kansas and Missouri into Illinois and Indiana. Record-setting snow developed just to the west of St. Louis and moved off to the east, so we had both quiet conditions over parts of the Midwest as well as very active conditions. If we look at the percent of normal precipitation, red is below normal, blue is above. This is that track of the snow that I mentioned, sort of came across this region right here. And you can see if you were in that track, it ended up with above normal precipitation, but just to the north and just to the south, precipitation was below normal. This is the reports of snow. The heaviest snow was in the areas of green and blue, and even though it extended all the way back to Colorado, it really started picking up here in eastern parts of Kansas, then across Missouri, across St. Louis. It received the most snow in 30 years, and then it moved across the areas of Illinois into Indiana. A very significant snow event in that in those regions. Sort of interesting, though, as you might suspect this time of year in spring, it melted very quickly, and right now you can see the only snow left on the ground is that traditional band that we've had throughout the entire winter. This has really been the story this winter, and it's very well defined. We go from heavy amounts of snow to no snow over very short periods of time, so areas of space. So if you're in right here in Minnesota, you have significant amounts of snow on the ground. If you go in this part of Minnesota, no snow whatsoever, so very abrupt edge of the snow. And water equivalent standpoint, the maroon, the lighter amounts of purple here is more significant water equivalent, and then you go down to nothing. So I've been saying for the number of weeks now that from a spring snowmelt perspective, even though there's very heavy snow, the areal extent is extremely confined this season. So it looks like there could be some significant flooding, but it's going to be localized this year, and this is what the outlook calls for. Major flooding is a possibility, but it's in just a very small area, and that might even be pulled back a bit in the next issuance. But it looks like for the most part for the Midwest, the potential for flooding is going to be below normal, except for a localized area of eastern North Dakota, maybe northern North Dakota, and then into Minnesota. So as far as soil moisture goes, for the most part over the Midwest, we have a very clear dividing line here I want to point out. And this was set up last fall, and it remains in place right in here. Eastern parts of the Corn Belt are range from normal conditions to even slightly wet now with this additional snow. Then if we get into the western parts of the Midwest, it's still quite dry with that lingering impact of the drought. Now you might say there's been some improvement over the winter. Yes, there has. There's always going to be some improvement over the winter, but generally speaking it was not enough, and there's still significant deficits over parts of Nebraska, parts anywhere from Kansas up across Nebraska into South Dakota. Now, I mentioned last week the record negative Arctic oscillation. Here we went to right here. You can sort of put it in perspective for the rest of the winter how that really was. Now keep in mind that the active precipitation bands often develop on these transitions, not necessarily right when we're at the bottom or right at the top, but during these transitions. So right now we're going through a transition from this negative up very quickly towards neutral, and that's where we usually get enhanced precipitation in certain areas. Now I'm going to mention here other areas that can be very quiet. So the forecast for the next couple weeks is several changes here. I wanted to point out, here's one transition right here. Here's 2 as we went from this negative to this neutral. Here's 3 as we dip again. And then here's 4 as we ultimately, as we get towards the middle of March, get into a more of a positive oscillation, which we only seen once this winter, actually a couple times, but really not since February that we've been in a positive phase. So the big picture this week is when we get into more of a neutral type Arctic oscillation, we can either have a west to east flow, but often we get a split jet stream, and that's what we're going to have this week. And with a split jet stream, typically the northerly branch is associated either with quiet weather or light precipitation, and the southerly branch is associated with more active precipitation. So the heaviest rain is going to be with that southerly branch, and over the Midwest, it looks like we're going to be more in the northerly branch, which is going to be fairly quiet. And that's why the precipitation outlook this week, very quiet. There could be some light snow over the upper Midwest, over parts of the Dakotas, but for the most part, it's going to be quiet. And matter of fact, a very broad part of the Midwest looks like it's going to be rain-free for much of the next week. So it's going to be a pretty quiet week. But on the other hand, look to our south. This is that southerly branch of the jet. Southerly branch is going to be very active. Now, I thought I'd take a look at some of the climate models to sort of take a hint at week 2. And these are climate models. This is week 1. The red here is below normal precipitation, and the green and blue are above normal. There you go. There's your northerly jet. There's your southerly jet. Now, week 2, when we start to get into that positive phase of the Arctic Oscillation, we're going to have some ridging or building of the jet stream, and that's going to quiet things down over the south, and that could enhance precipitation over parts of the Midwest, mainly over the central part of the Midwest, Kansas, Missouri, maybe a little bit further north into Illinois and Indiana. Upper part of the Midwest looks like it's going to be fairly, maybe a little bit quieter, but there could be more precipitation in week 2. So when we average these 2 weeks, when we look at the 2 weeks, looks like there could be a positive gain in soil moisture over parts of the Midwest, but generally speaking, it looks like generally dry over parts of the Midwest as well. So it's sort of a mixed bag as we average these 2 weeks together. I'm a little bit skeptical right now of this band right here. That's coming with a rain and snow event, actually a snow event. We'll have to see how that works out. So the takeaway from this week's briefing, the Midwest is going to be under the influence of the northerly jet. That means it should be a fairly quiet week, and soils will be drying most areas throughout this week. I wish you all a happy Easter. I will be updating my newsletter this week. I'll be talking a lot more about the outlook. If you ever have anything you'd like to pass along to me, any information or any questions, you can always email me at john@bluewateroutlook.com. I will be updating this again next Sunday. Have a nice week.